Evolution. We are officially onto our last subtopic or topic of Unit 4, Topic 2, Evolution. This topic's going to be split up into three subtopics. This first one is just introducing evolution, the processes, some key terms. Second one's going to be looking at microevolution, and the last one at macroevolution. Now, a lot of what we talk about is probably going to be similar from your studies of evolution in junior science, but we're going to be expanding on all of that and getting a little bit more specific into how the mechanics of it work. This chapter is going to be split up into two videos. This first one, I just want to set the scene and focus on that first dot point there, defining the terms evolution, microevolution, and macroevolution. So we're going to go through and look at a little bit of the history to set the scene and then define those terms. In the next video, we'll look at evolutionary radiation and evolutionary timescales, and also revisiting phylogenetic trees and cladograms. Now, while the history of evolution is not specifically mentioned in the syllabus, I think it's probably important background information just to set the scene of where we are now and how we came to these theories and ideas. When we look in the late 1600s, most Western civilizations, which were the ones that a lot of the scientific institutions that ideas were coming out of at the time, were basically fitting their scientific theories within the idea of the religious views at the time. And they held this idea of natural theology, which stated that organisms are unalterable and that we have all the organisms we'll have. All the organisms that exist now are the ones that we've always had, and they're not changing. But scientists started to notice differences. Naturalists started to notice variations within species, and they noticed how also, on the other side of that, similarities between closely related species. Geologists were finding fossils that looked really different to today's species and fossils of organisms that no longer existed. And so this theory of natural theology started to be questioned. From all of that, it took, probably another 100 years or so before Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, a French naturalist, came out with what is effectively the first theory of evolution in 1809. His theory said that an individual's efforts over their lifetime would drive adaptation, and these adaptations could be passed on to their offspring. Effectively, he was saying that evolution is driven by an inner need and self-driven. It wasn't influenced necessarily by other extraneous factors. Lamarckian evolution is probably best shown looking at the example of giraffes. So according to Lamarck's theory, the original short-necked giraffes were all competing for food, and the giraffes wanted to stretch their neck higher and longer so they could reach up higher leaves. Okay, they stretched and they stretched and they stretched and they kept stretching until their neck became progressively longer and longer and longer. Okay, now, according to Lamarck, this longer neck that a giraffe developed during its life is then passed on to its offspring. Some other evidence that Lamarck used was he looked at blackjacks and their sons, and he basically said, blacksmiths and their sons, and he basically said that blacksmiths were working all day, slaving away in their forge, enduring a lot of physical labor, and as a result, they were quite strong, well-built men. And he noticed that blacksmiths' sons tended to also be strong and well-built. He attributed this to the fact that, blacksmiths are undergoing a lot of physical labor and building up those muscles, and they can then pass that on to their kids. What he didn't realize is the underlying genetics there, that the people who are likely to be successful as blacksmiths and have a long career as blacksmiths were already genetically predisposed to being strong, and so they could pass those genes on to their children. Weissman basically very elegantly refuted this idea of Lamarckian evolution by getting a heap of mice, cutting off their tails, letting them breed, and lo and behold, all of the offspring had tails, therefore disproving the idea. So the next up, and the theory that we more or less still work with today, was Darwin and Wallace, and they came up with natural selection or descent with modification, which, as I said, is basically what we use today. Both of them were on independent travels. Alfred Russel Wallace was collecting and observing species in Indonesia, while Charles Darwin was on his journey with the HMAS Beagle. Both of them collecting, observing species, and they noticed how closely related organisms were. And they basically came up with this idea that we know as descent with modification, which says that all organisms came from a shared ancestor and they become more adapted over time. They become adapted to their environment. Now, Alfred Russel Wallace is a bit younger than Darwin and was less famous than Darwin. And so he really looked up to Darwin and sent him a letter with his theory. And Darwin basically left him on red when he realized that Alfred Russel Wallace had come up with the same theory as him. Charles Darwin then moved forward and published his theory, and then wrote back Alfred Russel Wallace and was like, oh my God, I'm so sorry, I forgot to write you back. Yeah, like I had the same idea. You know, maybe you could add to what I've done. Trying to basically scoop Alfred Russel Wallace. One of the things that Darwin did do slightly better, though, was he gave a little bit more of the mechanism behind it, whereas Alfred Russel Wallace more or less just gave observations. But Darwin published his On the Origin of the Species, where he argued that individuals within a population showed variation of traits. So individuals within a population could show variations, which we know is 100% true, and that those traits that were most suited to their environment would have an advantage. And those individuals with those traits would pass on those traits and they would reproduce more often. The favorable traits would then be more common in the next generation and in the next and in the next and in the next, until eventually you've got an organism that is effectively changed past what it originally was. And this process is known as natural selection. He took the idea off the back of artificial selection, which is basically selective breeding, which they were doing at the time in agriculture in order to get bigger cows, in order to get better corn, in order to selectively breed certain breeds of dogs. So he took the idea of artificial selection and made it into natural selection. So when we look at natural selection, which should not be new to you at all, the end result of that is a change in our gene pool. So what we end up with is a population that initially would have had a certain allelic frequency. The alleles of a particular gene within that population were of a certain composition. Using the example at the bottom there, let's say we had 70% green alleles and 30% blue alleles. Now, if natural selection acts so that it favors blue, then over time, the population will increase the number of not just blue individuals, but blue alleles. And so there's a change in the gene pool, a change in the allelic frequency or the number of each alleles. And this change is known as microevolution. So microevolution is any change in a gene pool of a population. And it results in very small amounts of variation in that population, but over time and over multiples of these changes as they compound, then we can end up with large-scale evolution. One important thing to recognize with microevolution is that a population that undergoes microevolution will still be considered the same species as their ancestor. They're just slightly different. We can see this in magpies. If you look along the eastern edge of Australia, magpies are slightly different in terms of their black and white patterning, basically north of Canberra compared to south of Canberra. So next time you're in Melbourne, have a look at the magpies. You'll notice they've got a slightly different patterning. This also happens in antibiotic resistance in bacteria that we see, which is a very big problem these days. Another example for you there, we've got some beetles that can either be green or yellow. In the first generation, we had 75% green alleles, 25% yellow alleles. Okay, over time through some microevolution in the second generation, we end up with 71% green alleles and 29% yellow alleles. A minor change, but one that will compound over time and result in effectively probably a yellow population at the end of it. Some other examples that we can see here of, as we said before, microevolution causing differences in a population. As that builds over time, we end up with macroevolution. So you can see that we've got blue-footed booby here. That's the bird. They can have webbing or no webbing. We've got our peppered moth example, which we'll look at in more detail when we look at microevolution, that you can have the black or the white, and there's the two different variations there. So these microevolutionary changes are building over time to create differences in a population. And as that happens over larger timescales, that results in macroevolution. Macroevolution is defined as major evolutionary change above the level of species, which produces descendants that are a different species. And macroevolution only occurs through a collection of microevolutionary changes over time. So microevolutionary changes result in variation in a population, but no new species. Macroevolution results in new species forming. So this is species level evolution. This process happens over what we call geological time, which is very large time scales. It results in divergence of a species. So we start off with a single ancestor that then will basically split into two potential descendant ancestor lines. And those two different lines can turn into different species. So an example of this is the large variety of mammals that we have, all evolved from one common mammalian ancestor. That original mammalian ancestor would have diverged into two different organisms, two different species, which then spread and spread and spread, all of the while having lots of splitting along the way. So we have a look at this example on the side here. We had species A diverged into species B, and then species B diverged into two lines. And from that one line, we end up with cows. Okay, from that other line, we ended up with C. After C, we had a divergence that resulted in hippopotamus, or D, which led us to the ancestors of whales. Okay, from D there, we end up with a divergence that gives us either the Indo-Hyas, which is what we consider the first sort of ancestor of whales, the first whale-like sort of organism. And then from the Indo-Hyas, we either have that or we have E, which leads us to the Pachycetus. Pachycetus then splits into the Ambliocetus or the Rhamnopterocetus, and so on. Each of those is creating a divergence over time that eventually led us to Balaenoptera musculus, which I think is the blue whale from memory. This is all through macroevolutionary changes creating new species. We can track how these species are related as well through various different means that we're going to look at over time. We've got the pentadactyl limb there, which you should remember from year 10. Okay, and we can also look at similarities in terms of genetics. So that graphic there with the different whales is tracking the genetic similarity of these different species of whales. So microevolution, change in allelic frequency or change in a gene pool that results in variation but no new species. Macroevolution results in larger changes that accumulate to cause new species to diverge. Evolution in general is just the term that we use to describe any change in allele frequency or characteristics of a population over time. It can result in new species, unlike microevolution. So evolution sits somewhat between micro and macro evolution. There's a great video at that link there. When you're on the PowerPoint, click on that and follow it through. That should give you a great summary.